Good morning, and thanks for joining us this morning. So we can report out sort of on the way point on this project, which is uh, tailored towards developing conservation plans for Long Island Sound marsh complexes. And this workshop, we're trying to gather people um, from Suffolk County and in particular the western portion of Suffolk County, closest to Nassau. But the other thing I will note is that these workshops are being recorded. So just so you know, if you speak up or if you need to consult any of this material for reference afterwards, or if there are colleagues who might be interested in some of this material that you'd like to share it with. Oh, as a disclaimer, this project is funded with EPA funds, and it's funded through NEIWPCC and the Long Island Sound Study in partnership with NEIWPCC, but it hasn't gone through EPA agency peer review, so it's not officially endorsed product of the agency. Vicky, did you make it on the call? I saw you sort of bounce on and off, but I'm not sure if you're on or not.
I'm on now. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Good morning. Good. So
Good morning.
We'll do just quick introductions. And Vicky, why don't you go first now that I have
yeah, hi. This is Vicky O'Neill. I'm the Long Island Sound Study Habitat Restoration Stewardship Coordinator with NEIWPCC, located at New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Thanks. Marco? Oh,
good.
Oh yeah, there you are. Good.
Yes, good morning. My name is Marco Propatro, and I've been working as a research associate at Warren Pinnacle and working on slums since 2011.
And I'm Jonathan Clow. I've been an environmental consultant working mostly for EPA clients since the mid-1990s, and have a truly micro consulting firm working with currently with Marco here in central Vermont since early 2000. So I was wondering if the participants would be willing to introduce themselves. And sometimes it's hard to do that in a Zoom meeting because everybody kind of talks over one another. That's why I'm broadcasting the, but it'd be nice to hear from you and what your relationship is to marsh conservation in general. And so I've broadcast the participant list, and maybe we can go in order of this. So Adam, are you willing to give us a sentence about who you are?
Good morning. Yeah, Adam Stark with the Nature Conservancy. I've been working in some marshes that we own across Long Island for about 10 years or so now.
Thank you. Alan? If you are still muted, if you you could also go ahead. Oh, no microphone. Sorry. So yeah, you can just thanks, Alan. Thanks for typing it in the chat. That's good, because that's a good way that we can communicate as well in terms of asking questions. So please feel free to ask questions out loud and also via the chat. I was hoping that you know, if people that do have microphones, it's good to hear your voices. So Ariel.
Good morning. My name is Ariel Santos. I'm with the Seatuck Environmental Association on Long Island, and we are an island-wide conservation organization. So I'm here just to learn more about everything that you're doing and get a little bit more involved with salt marsh work.
Thanks. How about Benjamin?
Hey, this is Ben Maher. I'm with Audubon, New York. Work in some salt marsh restoration projects for the benefit of salt marsh nesting birds and also increasing coastal resilience.
Thank you, Ben. Camilo?
Oh, yes. Hi, this is Camilo Salazar. I work for Suffolk County Water Quality Unit, and we've been working with coastal restoration projects for quite some time, perhaps 10, 12 years. We also do different kinds of projects across the county. I've been personally involved with salt marsh restoration for quite some time, designing, implementing, applying for grants, managing the grants, and so on. We have several projects going on coastal resiliency and marsh restoration, mostly on the South Shore.
Thank you. David.
This is David Kozak with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and I am working with Warren Pinnacle Consulting to apply the SLAM model in Connecticut to evaluate the effect of sea level rise, not only on our marshes, but on coastal road flooding.
Thanks, Dave. Jennifer? Thanks. I see your response in the chat up there with Suffolk County Economic Development and Planning, water quality. Thank you, Jennifer. Nicole?
Hi, good morning. This is Nicole Tachiki. I work in the EPA Long Island Sound office, and I'm the program coordinator for the Long Island Sound study. And I'm just interested to learn more about this tool.
Thank you. And Seika.
You actually pronounced it correctly. I am Seika Robinson. I'm part of the Wetlands Protection Section of the EPA. I'm just here to learn more about this tool and see if I can use it in what I do and work.
Thank you. And Sophia.
Hey, this is Sophia. I am also from EPA, from the Wetland Protection Program. Mostly work with Long Island, New York City. And I have to apologize in advance because I'm going to have to jump up in about 40 minutes. But thank you.
Thank you. And Emily, you were in the waiting room, but I think Marco let you in.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. My name is Emily Hall. I am also with CTUC Environmental Association, as Ariel mentioned. And we do work island-wide, and we're always interested in, different types of habitat, and especially learning more about marshes. So I think we're both excited to see this tool.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being willing to introduce yourself. We're going to be bouncing back and forth between some presentations, some hands-on training, just to make sure everyone's comfortable with using the WebGIS that we produced. And then hopefully we'll close with some open discussion in terms of developing groups to prepare marsh conservation plans, which is why it was so helpful to get everyone's background coming in. The purpose, sort of, which is self-evident from the title of the project, is to try to provide information for the development of marsh conservation plans that would be something that would be designed to increase coastal resilience and increase partnership across agencies and groups in terms of managing that coastal resilience. And so there are...
Jonathan.
Okay, Marco, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just forgot to ask you if you start the recording. Looks like, but I just want to double check.
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, fortunately Zoom starts it automatically for me, so it bypasses that important memory, which I would almost definitely forget each time. So thanks for asking. So there's a really kind of three parts to this, and the first part was that is sort of leveraging some existing model simulations that look at the combination of marsh fate and marsh migration footprints that was funded by NYSERDA for the entirety of coastal New York State. And that's what we're presenting here are the data projects and the viewer that we produced as part of that analysis. And following this presentation, where we show you about the viewer and the data analysis and the tools that we have available, we're going to go through a process of about 3 months where we try to work with municipalities and other marsh conservation stakeholder groups to develop some documents. They could be short documents, they could be longer documents. Marsh conservation plans that outline the benefits that the marsh complexes that we are discussing have for the communities, the risks to those marsh complexes, and potential pathways towards conserving those marshes. Then in February and March of next year, we're planning on participating in some community workshops with wider invitation to roll out the conservation plans, what we've learned and what are in them. And then do some revisions based on that. We were hoping to meet with you all in person and with the communities in person, just try to develop some of this collaboration. But obviously, the pandemic has not made that possible, so we have to do that through this Zoom format, which seems to dominate everybody's life these days. In terms of the site selection, we started out by selecting all of the larger marsh complexes in the New York, Long Island Sound coastal watershed. So all the large pieces of contiguous marsh, and by sort of naming those and characterizing them individually as areas that might be subject to individual conservation plans. And in this, we're going to be kind of focusing on the region from Marsh Complex 10 here, which is Calmstead State Park, over to West Meadow Creek, although we will do a couple of hands-on exercises that focus on Mount Sinai Harbor. So the primary modeling concept here is that we need to look at the impact that future sea level rise will have on marshes and the available habitat. And the conceptual model is a fairly simple one. Based on looking at the historical record, we can see that where marshes used to exist, where they currently exist, really are with an equilibrium of the sea level, which makes sense because marshes need a certain degree of flooding in order to have the right salinity for them to be the dominant species. But then to look at the potential for future sea level rise on that and note that there is a horizontal movement that's associated with that vertical movement of sea level rise, and just do some projections and see what that looks like. The modeling that we've done takes into account barriers to marsh migration, and Dave will, I'm sure, appreciate. I don't know that that we give ample credit to the fact that this comes from the NROC Make Way for Marshes document, these graphics that we're borrowing. But there's a couple of things that that can prevent that. There can be steep terrain, which we actually tend to see a lot in the North Shore of Long Island, as fairly good vertical relief, which is good, generally good news for property owners, but not as good news for marshes trying to migrate, as well as the potential for barriers, land development, seawalls that would prevent marsh migration from occurring. That would be something you would want to consider both sort of in the current state and also in the potential future state of additional flooding when people start to protect their developed lands. But the modeling that we are looking at is somewhat simple on the basis of, as the sea level rise, the marshes move horizontally. But there's another piece to that, which is the fact that marshes respond to being flooded more frequently as sea levels rise. There's a two-pronged thing that occurs. First of all, the marshes themselves put more energy into the shoots rather than the roots as sort of a natural biological response to rising sea level. But also, as they're flooded more frequently, and perhaps this is the more important mechanism for change in elevation, as they're flooded more frequently, they trap more inorganic sediment, and you end up with a change in the elevation of the land below the marshes, a process that we generally call accretion, even though that's only sort of a part of it. It's really sort of the elevation change under the marshes, but we've just kind of fallen into maybe the bad habit of calling it accretion, which would be exclusively, which wouldn't take into account shallow subsidence. But I'm in danger of going down a tangent for no reason. So the model that we used is called SLAM, the Sea Level Affecting Marshes model. And it's a relatively simple model, although it tries to simulate all of the dominant processes in wetland conversions. And it includes 26 different land cover types, which I'll discuss shortly. It runs relatively quickly it's a landscape type model. It's not calculating sort of every high tide, every low tide, and every storm and the impact. And so that enables it to run pretty quickly. It's looking at what's going to happen with equilibrium with different sea level rises. And it has a fairly wide base of users, federal, state, and NGO. It was originally developed by EPA and has been used by USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy and National Wildlife Federation have used it a lot. And obviously as state users as well, as these NYSERDA results attest to, as well as a lot of work down in the Gulf of Mexico, which is the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, groups of states together. And so at its heart is a relatively simple model, which suggests, as we saw, that different types of marshes are going to occur at equilibrium, are going to come to equilibrium with how frequently they're flooded. So you have a sort of a high marsh category, which would be flooded less often than daily. It's going to be somewhat less saline usually, and it's going to have a different species footprint and offer different ecosystem services. You have a low marsh habitat, which is generally flooded daily. Below that, below the mean tide level, generally approximately is where you no longer can support vegetation. And so you have beaches and tidal flats. And then the model results show results at low tide. So below that, it's going to show open water. And then up here, you have a combination of dry land and freshwater wetlands. And so the concept is, as you go back and forth and you add sea level rise, kind of as we looked at before, you're going to have these marshes move horizontally as a function of that sea level rise. Now, this model was originally developed back in the mid-1980s with EPA funding under very simple computers, really very large cell size. And so through the years, we've really narrowed the cell size. The results that we're going to be looking at today are based on a 5-meter cell size. I think the original model was with a 500-meter cell size. But also there's a lot of complexity that we built into the model over time. It always included this accretion concept, but now we have accretion feedbacks. We look at hydraulic connectivity, which we can look at in larger cell sizes. We can look at marsh collapse as you convert from a less saline to a more saline marsh. There is evidence that you lose some of your elevation under those circumstances. And we've done a lot of work with uncertainty analysis because as a simple model, there are some simplicity in terms, there are some simplifications in terms of the parameters. But because it runs relatively quickly, we have the capability to run the model over and over again and look at variance in those parameters and get different results. And I'm just going to go really quickly over this concept of accretion one more time. And this is sort of, this graph here is based on the work of Jim Morris, his paper in 2002, which showed that there's kind of a parabolic curve that is a relationship between the rate in which a marsh moves vertically and where it occurs. This is in the tidal frame. So as you have, so as you move over to the right on this axis, you're talking about marshes that are much higher in the tidal frame, and they would therefore be subject to less flooding. They're not being flooded very often. There is still some accretion generally going on and measured due to this organic matter production. There is still some trapping of sediment due to the infrequent flooding. But as they start to flood more frequently, his model and his data showed that the accretion rate can go up quite a bit. And that gives some of these marshes that start with elevation capital, gives them some resilience to sea level rise up to a certain point, at which point those marshes get lost when they enter sort of this unstable zone. And I think we already covered that adequately for the moment. So I'm going to see if there are any questions currently before going on and starting to introduce the viewer that we produce with these model results and some hands-on exercises. So feel free to either ask your question out loud or to type in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and move forward for the moment and we can ask. So right, the question was, as a simple model, what level of localized resolution can SLAM offer? I mean, that is an interesting question because you've got, in one sense, you can consider localized resolution in terms of 5-meter cell size. So you're going in very close and you're getting some information on that. On the other hand, I think when you look at some of these local processes, for example, let's say there was a model of a particular tidal spit that's extending, and there are going to be factors that are they're acting on that fine scale that are not going to be included in the model. So some of these really localized, we do model erosion, but we sort of model an average erosion across the study area. So our hope is to get overall the impact of erosion on marsh fate, but not necessarily to promise that we're getting one of those 5-meter cells exactly correct. The other question is, does the model differentiate between biological and mineral accretion? Well, when we produce these models for NYSERDA, we did a 2-step process. The first step process was to actually apply Jim Morris's MEM model, which does incorporate both biological and mineral accretion independently. But then we fit that model because that model is actually not very tightly constrained. It has a number of open parameters that it's very sensitive to, such as the amount of suspended sediment in the water and basically the efficiency at which marshes trap sediment. So we calibrated that model to existing data. And then ultimately, as we went forward, we kind of just developed curves and fit those curves to the existing data instead of continue to use that. So ultimately, the model does not really differentiate between biological and mineral accretion, but it is using data that combine those two. And then another question about the sediment budget approach for the model, which is a good question, and it's a weakness of the model that we're going to point out, is that we really don't take into account the sediment budget. So if you had an erosion of a bluff or an erosion of a bank, that sediment is not going to be sort of made available for the marshes. So I think that is a considerable weakness of the model, which Marco is going to touch on shortly. Now let's take a look at this at the Marsh, the interactive fate viewer. So you should have this URL from both the worksheets that we sent out, also from the emails that we sent around, and it's warrenpinnacle.com and then LI maps with capital LIM. So let me go ahead and see if I can. Okay, and here I have the viewer open. And so actually, before I jump into that, I'm going to come back to this slideshow and just talk just briefly about what you're going to see in the viewer. One of the things, the characteristics of SLAM is that it has a lot of detail. As we've developed it through the years, we've applied it in a lot of different ecosystems, and different users found different types important, like cypress swamp, flooded cypress swamp, mangrove, but a lot of these are not relevant, and potentially also looking at different types of open water that the model predicts. But we really made an effort to simplify that in this case, both to remove the irrelevant categories and also to take into account the fact that there are some overlap in terms of, say, for example, an irregularly flooded marsh and a transitional salt marsh, which includes both an emergent marsh and also potentially includes the scrub shrub. They basically exist at the same elevation. So kind of combining those categories. And we ended up with these 6 categories that we summarize results with. We have this gray color, which characterizes land that is not vegetated. So that includes tidal flats and beaches. A low marsh category, which is irregularly flooded, which is this sort of lime green color. The high marsh color, which is the light blue color, which includes both the irregularly flooded salt marsh and the transitional marsh, as I mentioned. Combining those made some sense. We have a freshwater non-tidal, so that would include a freshwater marsh or a fresh swamp. We do have this tidal fresh category, which is pretty rare, not only on Long Island Sound, but nationwide. It is one of the more vulnerable and rare categories. And that's the reason we called it out, is because in some cases, those are particularly sensitive lands. We also categorize flooded developed lands. So these are areas that could potentially have marsh habitat on them, but currently are developed. And we got we have some percent impervious layers that we use to characterize whether something is developed or not. So that would include both buildings and roads, parking lots, and the like. And the sea level rise scenarios we're going to look at, we looked at the 2016 New York Governor's Office scenarios, and we're focusing on the low, medium, and high projections, which range from almost 40 centimeters. The medium is slightly under 1 meter, and the high is almost up to 2 meters. There are for the New York Governor's Office, they had separate sea level rise scenarios for New York City and the lower Hudson and Long Island, with the Long Island results being slightly lower. So for this analysis, we're looking at the slightly lower sea level rise scenarios as considered relevant to this study area. We also looked at, we're also going to show that there's uncertainty analysis results on this. And when we did uncertainty analysis, we produced a triangular distribution based on a literature analysis in terms of what we thought was the most likely sea level rise. But we also ensured that especially this upper range is consistent with the uncertainty analysis, the uncertainty data presented in the Governor's Sea Level Rise report. The upper confidence interval is consistent with that. So basically a triangular distribution, when we run the uncertainty analysis, we draw sea level rise between these two, between this 0.3 and 2.3 meters. And if you were to build a histogram from all those draws, from those hundreds of draws, it would end up with this triangular. So the most likely draw would be right about 1 meter. And you'd be very unlikely to have a result of 0.3 or 2.3. And this is what the cumulative distribution function looks like. So again, that just shows that half the draws are going to be above, so it's like 1.15 or whatever that value is, and half the draws are going to be below. We're not really drawing below 0.4. So in terms of the sea, I guess one thing to point out in terms of this is that I also plotted the low, medium, and high against this. So the low sea level rise scenario, based on our professional judgment, really is at the very lowest end of the uncertainty. The medium sea level rise scenario is a little bit lower than what we think is likely, and the highest sea level rise is a little bit higher than what we think is likely. But just to give you a context of when you look at the uncertainty analysis results, they actually skew a little bit to the higher than the low, medium, and high results that we're looking at. All right, so at that, I will go ahead and start showing this viewer that we produced. So one of the things that we were trying to do was to leverage these model results that we had, one of the things to point out here. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to have to click past the disclaimer again. So hopefully that straightforward, but is a necessity for this project. And to the left here, we have the legend that shows all what you're looking at. And so this is going to change as you select different options to the right. But one of the things to point out here is that there is the modeling project website, which is shown here, which will link you to the NYSERDA projects. And there's a tremendous amount of data that are available on this site. And however, most of it required you to download very large GIS files, have some degree of GIS expertise. And so the goal with this viewer was to both bring some of the data that we produced for that other project and make it much more easy to use, but also to cross-reference that with tax parcels, as we'll see, just to assist with planning. So at that initial view, you can hover over the different areas just to get a sense of how they were named. And you also have the capability to use this zoom to menu just to choose one of these locations, and it will jump you right in. And when you jump in closer, as you move in and out you go back and forth between sort of the study areas and results that show you a combination of the tax parcels and also the sea level rise results. So I'm going to start for simplicity and up to the upper right, you have a lot of control over the map that you're looking at. And so for simplicity, I'm just going to turn off the tax boundary so we can just look at the sea level rise results. There are 3 different options to the lower right here that you can look at. To the lower right on the upper right, the lower part of the upper right. You can look at the probability maps, which show the probability of a map of a marsh at a given date, given the uncertainty analysis results that we were looking at, uncertainty and sea level rise primarily, but all the model parameters. And on the bottom, next to the legend here, there is a slider, which you can move back and forth and look at different times. So if you start at this location, and we're at Comset State Park, the original data that we had were based from the year 2004, and you can pretty much see where the marshes are. And there's still even a little bit of uncertainty there because we are varying tide ranges based on the uncertainty of tide range. So there's a very small chance that there are marshes in some of these other areas. As you move through, you can see some of the existing marsh. Now, the existing marsh in 2004 starts out red with a high probability, around 90 to 100% probability. As you move through, some of that existing marsh you're starting to lose some of that marsh. And you have by 2100, it looks like sort of here in the heart of the marsh, and you can certainly go in a lot closer to get a sense of exactly what you're looking at. And again, these pixels are 5 meter sizes. You're down to something in the range of 10 to 30% probability. And you also can see areas where there was not marsh. So let's look at this area down here. And you can see that there's an expansion of marsh. So these areas are very likely by 2100 to have enough water, the right frequency of flooding in order to support marsh habitat there. So this now is a question in terms of what's there currently, and there's a number of ways to look at that. There are 4 different base maps that are available here to the right. So one of the ones that's most useful is to click on the imagery, which gives you the latest satellite imagery. So you can click on that and see that this area is currently looks like it's forested. And if you can turn on and off the overlay to see sort of what's currently in the marsh area. One of the things this viewer has been tested on a number. It should work on any browser. If we have any technical difficulties with it, we'd love to get that feedback. But we've tested it on Chrome, Safari, Internet Explorer, iOS, and Firefox. So we think it works, but I know for Chrome, you can use, when you have something like this selected, you can use the arrow keys and move back and forth through these buttons. And you can do the same thing with the dates. You can just use the right and left arrow key, which can be helpful in terms of controlling the interface without getting too finicky with the mouse. The other thing, so the black and white is a simple Marsh background, but it really makes the colors pop. So if you really want to have a sense of what's going on without all the confusion of like this interface between blue and green can get a little bit iffy. It pops a lot more on the black and white, and then just a couple of other options. So as you're rendering maps, you can get a sense that you can choose whatever you think is most useful. So the other piece that we have here is the Marsh type. And these are not uncertainty analysis results, but these are individual results. And so in this case, another slider becomes available above the date where you can look at low, medium, and high sea level rise. And if you're looking at the current condition, the sea level rise has no impact because we haven't started applying sea level rise in the current condition or 2004, however you want to characterize that. But again, so if you look at what's characterizing this marsh, looks like it's about 2/3 low marsh, so this lime green color. So these are getting flooded daily. We've got some unvegetated flats in there, and you have some high marsh there as well. And these data originated from the National Wetland Inventory. So if you're interested, you can go into the NWI mapper to get a sense of where these data came from. So the other thing you can do is, like if you go in and you want to take a look at this and go between marsh type and no overlay, just to see what that looks like in the satellite imagery. So the low marsh, and of course the satellite imagery is not likely to be, or we're not sure, it's not tidally coordinated as far as we know. So in terms of some of these areas which show marsh but actually show open water, that could be a result of high tide, but that gives you a sense of how this gets translated. So if you go back to the marsh type, and then let's look at the low sea level rise, you can then animate what would happen under sort of the best case scenario for sea level rise, starting in 2004 and going through 2100. So in this case, the sea level rise is relatively low. We said about 0.4 meters, which would, in order for a marsh to keep up with that, would only need to accrete at 4 millimeters per year. And our data show that marsh are accreting at that rate. So in terms of the currently existing marsh, it pretty much stays intact, but you do have some additional flooding occurring around the edges here, some areas that have the potential. And here's an area which highlights a little bit of the uncertainty in the model, in that the model does its best to take into account adjacent substrate in terms of determining whether an area is going to be a marsh or is going to be a beach. In this case, I would guess probably because we have all this unvegetated area around it, that this is less likely to be a marsh than something that is expanding that's adjacent to existing marsh. And I think the thing that is tricking the model in this case is the fact that these are estuarine beaches as opposed to ocean beaches. And if they were ocean beaches, the model would almost definitely be characterizing these as. So there are some uncertainties in terms of what's going on, and the model's not directly taking into account the inorganics of the substrate. But if we look at, let me bring the slider back down to the current condition, and we look at the medium sea level rise, and you scroll through, you start to see some different results. Certainly the tidal flat, the unvegetated tidal flat, which is subject to some degree of vertical movement based on data, but is a really simplified concept. And you start to see some opening up of open water within that. That's the other thing that I didn't mention about the categories, is that which is probably obvious, but we kept the dry land and the open water transparent so that you could get a sense of the context of where these maps are. So you start to have you start to have some conversion of this blue color to the green, which is extra salinity occurring. And you can see there's some fingers of unvegetated areas coming in to these low marshes. Now, if you go to the high sea level rise scenario, the results become more significant in that the vegetation footprint is really, really much smaller, and you have a lot more unvegetated marsh. So when you look at probability, when you look at probability, when you get an unvegetated tidal flat, that is not going to be considered a marsh, and so that color will be closer to this blue color. Let's see. So this over here we have, so in terms of zooming, I should have covered this a little bit earlier, but you can zoom in and out either using the scroll bar on your mouse, or you can use the plus minus bar over here. The legend has a lot of useful information. It'll always tell you what's going on in your map, and has options to get to a help file, which should really, if you have any issues in terms of navigating the viewer, all the information you need should be available through this help file, as well as information how to contact us if you have any technical issues. So, but the legend, once you kind of have a sense of what's going on with these, you may actually want your screen, so you can hide the legend and just work with the whole screen and show the legend again by just clicking on this button up here to hide and show. Let's see, I just want to make sure I covered everything that makes sense to cover here. The last thing that I want to, and we're going to cover tax, but the tax boundary piece is an important piece as well. So you can click and see what's going on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this as a black and white map background, and I'm going to turn off the marshes just for a minute. And so with the tax map, you can see where the parcels. So this is a very large area of public land here, the state park, but there are some private lands adjacent here, and you can click on those and get some information about what's going on, which we're going to cover going forward, how to interpret those. But you can get an overview of sort of which areas, if you add the marsh back on there, which areas that have marsh are public and which are private, which could have obviously an impact in terms of as you're thinking about conservation options. That's you can turn on and off the tax boundaries. The other thing is, if you want to look at tax boundaries, but you're trying to look at, say, a probability map, again, we have this issue where you have some of these are shaded black and some of them are shaded blue, and you're looking at a color scale that ranges from red to blue. So in order to get everything, you can turn off the colors on the tax maps just to get a sense of, make sure you have equivalence in terms of rendering colors, if you're not interested in, once you've kind of figured out the public-private breakdown to the extent that you're able to. All right. The last thing that I want to point out is that for each of these, so as you scroll through the study area, you can zoom out, you can scroll out, you can scroll in. It's going to render individual maps based wetlands based on where you are, and it's going to. This is one of the things that makes this a really lightweight viewer, is that rather than trying to render the entirety of the all the results for the entirety of Long Island Sound, we focus on these areas. But as you can see, sometimes there's a little bit, it tries to figure out where you are here. So for example, in this case, I'm gonna Nissisquog. Nissisquog. We're closest to Nissisquog, but as you scroll over here, you might have to zoom in and out just to make sure you got the parcel that you're interested in. But as you zoom in on this, there is a fact sheet that we developed for each of these named marsh complexes, and So you can click on that fact sheet and it brings up a PDF. The first 2 pages are some background of the project, which we've covered to some degree in this workshop, but they're the same for each of these fact sheets. Then as you get in, it gives you specific information about what you see at that location, and some specific results, including some tables of results, the potential for marsh migration, whether you're looking at gives you a sense of the vulnerability of the marsh, as well as whether you're looking at expansion on public or private land, whether you're looking at expansion in developed or undeveloped land. So I'm going to go back to the slideshow, right? So the goal in the fact sheets was to give an overview of each site, in terms of how it responds to sea level rise. And we're hoping that what we can do is go deeper in and start looking at some of these sites on a closer level through these conservation plans. The fact sheet graphics at this point should be somewhat straightforward. The current marsh, we've already discussed sort of how the color scheme for that, which is the same color scheme we use for the viewer, and the probability of the marsh habitat. And however, there is some results that are broken out for undeveloped and developed areas. So in this case, this is highlighting in the areas that are currently developed and that have marsh habitat coming into place. So that would, there'll be a lot more barriers to establishment of marsh in developed areas. That's another way that you can break down these results. Last thing I want to touch on with the fact sheets are these tables that we developed that kind of give a probabilistic assessment of marshes over time. In terms of the top row here is existing marsh area in acres. So you have currently there's 60 acres of marsh at this site that we're looking at. And these marshes are predicted to be resilient to sea level rise alone. That's another thing to point out, is that these model results aren't taking into account other anthropogenic impacts, whether it be, excessive nutrients that cause marsh loss, or boat use that causes marsh loss, or other erosional large storms that might cause large marsh loss, at least temporarily. So in terms of sea level rise, it's predicted to withstand sea level rise by 2055, pretty much given the full suite of uncertain sea level rise. By 2100, the expected value here is to lose about 1/4 of the marshes, which is pretty similar to what you're seeing on private lands. And the expected value is sort of taking each of the uncertainty analysis results, multiplying its result by the probability of it occurring. But then you also have this, in terms of undeveloped dry land, there are 10 acres of public land that could accommodate marsh expansion, and actually 32 acres of private land. So you have this potential of marsh growth due to sea level rise, because you have the marsh being somewhat resilient to sea level rise due to accretion, but then you also have the capability of expansion. However, there's an important question in terms of certainly private lands, whether the private lands will be willing to allow for marshes to occur, or whether there'll be some restrictions, whether there would be potential of building up seawalls to protect land and property. And then it also looks at the developed land, which in this case, it gives you 2 bits of information. One, sort of information about where you could restore impervious areas and have marsh habitat, but another piece that gives you just sort of a sense of the vulnerability of the infrastructure on a site. Okay, I'll pause for any questions now, and then we will jump on to the first hands-on exercise, which we had sent out. Hopefully everybody has that. If you don't have that, go ahead and put your email address in the chat, and we'll email that to you. go ahead and bring up that. All right, so not hearing any questions at the moment. This is kind of going to be an overview just to make sure everyone's comfortable with using the using the model. I'm sorry, using the viewer. And so there's some steps that you can do here, and we can discuss. So you can go. I'm going to take, I think, about 5 minutes for people to run through this. Maybe a little over 5 minutes, just in case anybody needs a water break or other type of break as well. We'll go through these bullets and we'll reconvene in just a moment. Okay, we'll start back in just about 1 minute. Okay, so hopefully people had a chance to go through this brief exercise and have some thoughts. So I guess the first question I would have is anybody have any notes or thoughts in terms of when you went to Mount Sinai Harbor and you just looked at the marsh type under the low, medium, and high sea level rise scenario? What did you see in terms of the predicted changes under each of these scenarios? And you can answer out loud. You can answer in the chat box if you'd like. So if I go to the low scenario and I animate the changes through 2100. Let me zoom out just a touch. There we go. Let me get this. Maybe I could this might be one of those opportunities to hide the black and white. I think is better to hide the legend. So what I'm seeing as a result here for the low scenario is the marshes are largely intact, again because we have a relatively low sea level rise through 2100 of at or below 4 millimeters a year. But you do have some expansion of marsh, and even under this lowest sea level rise scenario up here at Harbor Beach Road, there's definitely some potential for nuisance flooding, and you also have some loss of at low tide what would be tidal flats. So you start to see some impacts as well as some expansion of sort of flooding down here. If you go to the medium sea level rise scenario, anybody can feel free to chime in and discuss what they see under medium. What I'm seeing under medium is you see this conversion from, first of all, you see this conversion from blue to green, which is this high marsh to low marsh conversion, which is, we do predict there to be some loss of marsh capital at that time, at that conversion, because of the change in salinity and the impact that has on soil structure. But the other thing is that there are different ecosystem services that are provided by high marsh and low marsh, and so you're losing a lot of your marsh capital. But you also are seeing some loss of the green itself as well. So even in this medium scenario, and there's more action occurring on the barrier island to the north. Under the high sea level rise scenario, I think what you're really looking at here is some marsh. The marsh is being squeezed down here in the south. You can see like the overall marsh, you are having some expansion, but this is where what I was saying about I think these are primarily elevation barriers. You can see like in this case here, this road here is providing an infrastructure barrier to marsh migration. But you also just have elevation barriers, which again is good for infrastructure in the short run here, but not great for marsh migration capability. And if you look at this in a probability map, bit of information. So one thing that I see in terms of a strength of this approach is that you don't have to necessarily choose a sea level rise scenario, but you can just get an overall sense of what the probabilities are of marshes expanding or being lost in different locations based on that. One of the weaknesses is that there's no differentiation between the developed and undeveloped marshes, undeveloped areas for marshes. So this area up here to the north, is showing a lot of marsh. If you go ahead and convert that back to marsh type, there are a lot of barriers. There's a lot of development. There's a lot of barriers. The fact that would just be sort of a happy marsh is probably unlikely when you look at the imagery. So that's, I think, a weakness in terms of that. And that's something to bear in mind when you're looking at overall expected value results, although we do break it down into developed and undeveloped pieces. And then if you look at the tax boundaries, it's really a mix of public and private land here. But this town of Brookhaven owning this parcel up to the north. But there being some pretty large areas. If you put back the probability map, there being some larger areas. Well, again, this area up to the northeast is problematic because it has a lot of potential habitat or a lot of potential flooding, and it is very private and very developed. So then the other question was, if you look at the fact sheet, now that you've kind of done this investigation, if you look at the fact sheet to get the overview, does that match what your perceptions were from looking at this? And the fact sheet here says that under several sea level rise scenarios, current marsh coverage is predicted to suffer significant coverage losses since the majority of marshlands have relatively low elevations. And then it also talks about some of the other implications. But I think this table here is kind of instructive, because you can see that originally there's about 120 acres of marshes. And under all the sea level rise scenarios combined and averaged, we end up with 110 potential marsh acres. But that includes a lot of new marsh in dry land, both public and private. So this would include all this area in the north, in the northeast, sort of being very successfully converting to marshes, and also all the developed land being restored. And even then, you're not going to quite keep things. And a lot of the other sites, you're going to see this total potential marsh area is actually going up. So Mount Sinai Harbor is one of the areas where which is more vulnerable.
Yeah, but what this example is kind of interesting is really showing how maybe on one hand you are losing the existing marsh because of sea level rise, but potentially you could replace or have the possibility to conserve almost the same area by tapping in new areas like undeveloped or developed land. And then obviously it would cost differently because properties are private or public, but it's kind of a nice example of how potentially you can implement some policies for conservation of the future.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. That's a good point. So I think with that, unless do people have questions about using the viewer or or questions or comments on that? I got Camilo had said, I like the option to see the parcels that would be suitable for a marsh migration. Right, it'd be useful for land preservation acquisition based on probable scenarios. Yep, and that's exactly that was the goal going in, and I'm glad to see that potentially has some utility, and that's definitely our hope. And we'll talk a little bit about Marco's going to talk a little bit about the details of the modeling, and also about we tried to have a single metric that shows the potential ecosystem services for a parcel through the year 2100. So I'm going to go back to the slideshow and turn it over to Marco at this point.
Yeah. So on this section of the webinar, we're going to discuss a little bit some of the details that are behind our modeling. Just an overview, and some of you probably have listened to it already, but lots of people have seen that I haven't seen before, so it's interesting and instructive to go through some of the details just at glance, obviously. So the aspect that I want to discuss about is the data sources that we use, because these are really what comes into the model and how we can make the predictions. And so we are using different sets of sources. One are the elevation data, which are giving us the information about all the elevation of the landscape. And these days, LiDAR is becoming very common and more precise. That gives the distribution of this elevation, and it's important hydraulically to define the water paths. Then we have the land cover, which in particular we focus on the wetland layers that basically describe where the wetlands are and how the land is, the different habitats are. Typically, we use the national wetland inventory data, but sometimes locally or other entities have their own wetland layers, more precise, or a different source of information, and we use that too. It can be used as a spatial layer for the land cover. The other pieces that are important to information is dikes and impoundment and seawalls, because those are the ones that determine how the water flows are, really. If there is a dike, the water is not going to go through that dike unless the water goes above that dike. And then for the dry land, we look at and differentiate between what is undeveloped and what is developed using the impervious layers. That basically tell me if there is a parking lot, that's an impervious layer. If there is a forest, that's undeveloped. And then we have also information regarding erosion rates that are uncertain, but they usually come from literature. So what we do, we take all this data together, and we build up our model by having all these different layers coming into the picture. And as Jonathan has shown before, basically we define the habitat based on their elevation, relative elevation with respect of the sea level. And you have low areas that are mudflat, areas that get flooded every day, are low marshes, and as you go higher, you have high marshes, and then you go into dry land. And so one of the major work that we initially do is to combine both the spatial information and the tidal information, and we look at if our model is calibrated at least to the current condition. What does that mean? So basically, we look at if we have an area that is identified as marsh, and we have a certain tide regime, and you have a certain elevation, we want to see water going to this area. If we don't have water going to that area, we have to go back and look why water is not going there. And maybe because we're missing a water path, or maybe a culvert is in there that allows the water to go through. And so vice versa, if we get areas that are identified as dry and instead already in current condition, they get flooded all the time, we try to see if that's an actual real observation. And sometimes we have noticed that sometimes these things already happen these days, like nuisance inundation and events like this show that areas are getting more flooded, although they are identified as dry land. But overall, we try to match land cover and elevation, tides, and all water paths. And that's the big initial calibration work that we do on the model. And then we try to make projection. Having that, basically, we just start increasing the sea level. And basically, all these habitats will try to move upwards with respect of the sea level. And one of the important aspects for the marsh resilience is the existing marsh resilience, at least, is the accretion. And Jonathan has already spoke a little bit about that before. But basically, what we are modeling here is the capacity for the marsh to respond to increase the inundation. So imagine you have a marsh that initially is above mean tide level in this example, 1.5 meter or 1.5 above the sea level. So as long as the rate of sea level rise is, in this example, 2.5 millimeter a year, the marsh has the capacity of accreting at 2.5 millimeter a year, and so it's in equilibrium. The sea level rises, the marsh can accrete, and nothing changes. As soon as the sea level start accelerating a bit more, it basically starts inundating and drowning the marsh. And so the marsh responds, has the capacity to respond by increasing the accretion up to a certain extent. And so, for example, if the sea level increases at 5.5, the new equilibrium would be with 5.5 millimeter a year. But if the sea level started increasing more than, in this example, 7 millimeter a year, then the marsh will try to stand up with, keep up with sea level rise, but will not be capable, because at some point it reaches the maximum accretion and then it is not able to maintain the elevation. And so this is a really feedback answer to the sea level, increased sea level. And this has been observed by set data, by actually, there have been recently, in the last few years, more set data points have been collected to try to quantify this capacity of marshes to accrete and gain elevation once they are inundated. And so what we have done is, started from a mechanistic model that Jim Morris has developed that uses the physical component, and Jonathan discussed a little bit before. And what we've done, we did not create a mechanistic model, but we kind of just fit the curve within the observed point. And so we have this accretion curve that basically just are descriptive. They just describe what is in there. We don't look at mechanisms that are behind it. And this can be a limitation, but for our exercises, good enough, we think. And what we have, it's a lot of uncertainty. Can you go back? Yeah, so what we have, it's a lot of uncertainties. As you can see on the top right, we have a wide range of uncertainty. Accretion can vary quite significantly, and we don't really know also how the response will be in the future. So we want to keep to account on this uncertainty in our prediction, because this is something we don't want to set a value or a curve and then make all our prediction, but actually there is a flaw there. So we want to account of what we don't know in a way, and having this uncertainty included. So what the general approach that we took next.
Sorry.
No problem. Basically, we try to really look at this problem more on the uncertainty point of view. Like, lots of things are uncertain in this prediction. One of the biggest drivers is the sea level rise. Shall we model for low sea level rise scenario, for high sea level rise scenario? So we took a wide range of sea level rise scenario, and we kind of consider all of them together, the same way we did with tide ranges. With all the input parameters that come in, we kind of try to quantify this uncertainty. And so what we do lots of simulations based on all these different input parameters. And so we come up with hundreds of maps, and then having all these predictive maps, so many, we put them together by calculating average distributions of either the area for the salt marsh, or as we in the viewer, the probability that a certain cell can be a marsh or not, based on all this. And so it becomes more a question, instead of just seeing what the future might be, we are also putting some kind of likelihood in it based on what we know right now. And so here is an example of the high marsh in New York City, where all the different gray lines represent all the one simulation, and one simulation with a sea level rise scenario, different accretion rates, different elevation, because also elevation are uncertain in the LiDAR data. And so all of them, all these curves represent one result of one simulation. And then we summarize them all together with 90% confidence interval, or average expected value, and statistical quantity that gives you the likelihood of these scenarios. And here reported in color are the actual fixed sea level rise scenarios that were considered in particular, not in the probability approach. So, you know, with low, medium, high, medium, and high, and how do they place within this uncertainty range. And so one of the most important results of all this is that sea level rise is actually the drive of most of the model uncertainty. Having a wide range of sea level rise scenarios really is what it drives our big uncertainty on our prediction. And this is also important because when we want to focus on what we want to improve on our knowledge, we could maybe improve on improving maybe the LiDAR data or the accretion curve. But as long as we have the sea level rise that is very uncertain, these other efforts would be kind of have a minimal effect on our prediction. While if you are able to narrow down our uncertainty on sea level rise and say, we now are, you know, have a certain level of confidence that in 2100 sea level rise is going to be 1 meter instead of 40 centimeters, or instead of being 2.2 meters, that would definitely narrow down our prediction. But right now, that's where we are. Anybody want to chime in?
This is Dave Kozak. Can you hear me?
Yes.
The sea level rise scenarios that you use to develop the model, I know, are based upon some historic sea level rise data. And since then, there have been various federal agencies that put out more recent sea level rise data that have been regionalized for different parts of the coast of the U.S., including Long Island Sound. And many of those predictions of future sea level rise that are more recent are significantly higher than the rates used in the model. How would you suggest we explain the changes in sea level rise predictions from when the data that SLAM used were produced to our audiences?
That's yeah. So in the range we used at that time, I don't know how now the new predictions fit, but the wide range of the different scenarios. For example, the high scenario. There you go. The high scenario. So what we tried to do here was really have a high suite of ranges. So we went to the historic and very low probability to a pretty significant probability. Now, I had, the last data that I saw, I think we are still within this range. Maybe there is more likelihood to go on the higher range, which is already a little bit included in this curve. But it's you know, I don't know exactly, you know, unless you really rerun your SLAM simulation with a much narrow and you have confidence that that's your uncertainty range. I would say, you know, this is the one we use so far, and the one that we based our prediction on are kind of, I wouldn't say conservative, because they were also considering very high sea level rise scenarios, but at least cover what is considered today the range of likely sea level rise scenarios by 2100. But I may be wrong, Dan. If there are more recent values that they push things more on the right, quite significantly more on the right, then that probably some new SLAM simulation should account for that.
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting question, Dave, and I know the interesting thing is that so if we you know, when I looked at this and I plotted this, I was expecting actually the low, medium, and high to be more evenly distributed through this. So this kind of shows that our professional judgment that we use to derive this triangular distribution actually shows a sort of a bias to the right compared to what was in that 2016 report, in the fact that what was defined as a medium scenario of under 2 meters. You know, our professional judgment was that the most likely was above 1 meter, slightly above. I think it was 1.04 meters was most likely in terms of this triangular distribution. So in terms of, you know, there's always professional judgment in terms of interpreting these results, and I would say, you know, the most likely result, if you're looking at the deterministic result, is somewhere between the medium and the high. But the other thing is that we went pretty far out to the right, I think, you know, going all the way up to 2.3 meters. I haven't, you know, I think some of these are you, when you're talking about the regionalized data, you're talking about the NOAA work, which, you know, which showed, you know, significantly higher rates up in the Northeast.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I still don't think that they really go much over 2 meters by 2100. Now I could be wrong about that, but I think that we're still in the range, at least. But I have to go back and look at that. So I think that's an interesting, an interesting question. But I think the other thing to point out is that in the viewer, we chose low, medium, and high to keep things simple. We do also have a medium high simulation. So if we're developing, which is somewhere in the middle here, obviously, but if we are developing conservation plans and we want to focus on medium high as most likely, we have those data available. So we're not necessarily showing, in an effort to keep the viewer relatively simple, we're not necessarily showing the universe of available data.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing, like with respect of the viewer, and well, first of all, I wanted to just add that when we built this curve, basically, the high sea level rise scenario was considered the 90% likelihoods that most of the model were, at least in New York, where 90% of the model were lower than these high sea scenarios. And so we kept that in our curve. So our curve is built at 90% of the sea level rise scenarios are less than the high sea level rise. The other aspect that I wanted to just add is that based on our, for example, in the viewer where we have the probability, what would change would be the probability itself. So basically the footprint that you get in the viewer, and I'm going to discuss this a little later, but the footprint is the result of the very high sea level rise scenario. The fact that they're very low in probability, so the color is blue at the fringes at the end, is because these high sea level rise scenarios are not so likely. So in that case, if the sea level rise uncertainties push everything a little bit on the right, and you have higher sea level rise scenarios that are more probable, then those blue spots would be actually a little bit more on the purple side, so more probable. And so when you are considering, for example, your planning or you're designing some conservation policies, you might focus and say, well, we can look at all the probability about 10% because, or 5% if you think that those is more likely to happen because you have a sense that the probability is actually higher. Sea level rise scenario is actually more probable. Okay. All right, I lost, that's where I was at the end, yes. So basically, we have all these probability matter that we were discussing. And one of the, just to summarize, the model has obviously strengths and weaknesses. So the strength is really the relative simplicity. It's relatively simple. You just look at the position of the different habitats with respect of sea level. The code that we're using is open source, so everybody could come in and play with it. The data that is required is somehow minimal. You don't have to collect experimental data too much, which makes things a little less costly. And so it's easy to use, and the cost of application running simulation is quite simple. So making this prediction in a way is a kind of not that expensive, because you just have to run the model on a computer and have an idea on how your land cover would be in the future, and is relatively, especially these days, quick to run, doesn't require months of simulation, and at the same time it contains the major processes that are determining the wetland fate. So basically, you have a trade-off. You have the simplicity of the model, which maybe is simple, but we also introduce this uncertainty. So even if it's simple, we kind of account for all we kind of put all the complicated aspects of the model in the uncertainty simulation. And then, sorry, I lost what happened to my window here. Sorry. Can't zoom. How do you do it here? There you go. Sorry.
That's okay. Every now and then Zoom gets squirts around and produces these tiny little windows, and you can't find your way.
Yeah, because it's the bar of view option, or you're viewing Jonathan's screen and I can't maximize. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So the limitation of the model are, okay, again, the simplicity could be a strength, but could be a limitation. For example, hydrodynamic models are maybe more, they describe better the water flows in certain local conditions, while this model is kind of like a bathtub model. You just tap with water and see what the water level goes. We don't really mimic all the water flows, but at the same time, as I was saying, a hydrodynamic model might be better to describe current condition, but we don't know anything about the predictive capabilities of the hydrodynamic model. And as Jonathan also touched before, there is no mass balance of soil, but solids that have been taken out because of wave action are not redeposited or redistributed along the coast. So we actually lose them, really. Accretion, again, I said, is more a phenomenological description of the accretion process. Would be nice to actually have physical properties beneath it that determine the accretion, but we feel like the model is so uncertain that having the curve based on just a feet of the observed data is good enough to describe what might be the current and future response. And the erosion model is also very simple, related with mass balance and also the different aspects of how erosion really happens in reality. So we don't have that complexity in there. So one of the aspects that we have developed recently in the last few years is looking at the marshes, not only having more marshes better, because that would be probably one of the conservation strategies. Like the more area you have, the better it is. But trying to really come up with a measure of the ecosystem service that is provided, so that between marsh system, when you break them to tax parcel, you can start comparing based on the ecosystem service that they provide. And the reason of that, because if you think at the marsh system and what's their function, they can be very different depending who are you talking to. And so we want to include that is both quantitative and qualitative. And here we have few aspects. The wave attenuation depends, well, is an important aspect of the marsh, but that's very dependent where the marsh is. It's not just having more marsh, you get better wave attenuation. It depends if it's covering a certain neighborhood, especially in areas that have neighbors that have people living behind the marsh system. And so in that area, people would think that wave attenuation is the most significant function. Other functions are more natural related, nutrient sequestration, which is also an ecosystem a service provided by the marshes, and also habitat. It depends on providing habitat for fish, for the marsh to open water interface, the connectivity of the marsh. Those are all aspects that are very important on the ecosystem service provider. And then there is recreation, because, for example, especially in areas where you have mixed neighborhood of people living, the recreation aspect is also another important aspect, which is more qualitative, but still it's important. And so what we try to do, next please, is try to combine the prediction of how the marsh will face in the future with the stakeholder values, how do they value the marsh system, so that we can come up with some ecosystem value and benefits that the marsh system provides me. And in this way, we can relatively rank all the different marsh parcels, which one is more important, to focus on in terms of marsh conservation strategies. And you can think these at the marsh system scale, but in our case, like with the viewer, you could actually break it down to the actual single tax parcel. So you can think of each tax parcel being its own marsh system, and you want to evaluate how this marsh parcel is providing more ecosystem services than another one, if you are thinking about, for example, buying or giving an easement or protecting that area. And with that, what is important is the stakeholder input and expert input, because many of the questions on how these ecosystem services are really depend on who you are talking to. And even if things are qualitative, you still can create a ranking based on these qualitative features. And so you are trying to answer questions like, what do you value about this wetland? What is important to you? If your marsh gets half because you're losing half of it, or it gets fragmented, what is that you're losing in terms of utility that you're getting from this marsh? If there are several different services, recreation, marsh sequestration, wave attenuation, what do you value more relative to each other? Which of the marsh system offer more of what you're looking at? Like if you think fishing is an important component, which of the marsh system it's more important? So answering this question gives a qualitative aspect, but then allows you to create this ranking and able to identify which marsh parcel or tax parcel may be more important to focus on first in terms of conservation strategy. And with this, I accept any question. Also before, but.
And I'm going to just do a little bit more demonstration of, feel free to ask questions if you're interrupt me or fill in, but I'm going to just do a little exploration of the sites and look a little bit at the tax parcel results that we have available. So just to have a zoom through those 5 sites that we're really focusing on in Western Suffolk County. I'll put that legend back on again for a minute here. And going to black and white here. So right, for Compton State Park, we already kind of discussed a little bit about the fact that we have a lot of it's huge public parcel to the northeast of this site. And if we go to take a look at the marsh type, and so one of the couple interesting things that are going on here. So you have a lot of potential expansion of marsh over here to the east, and that's already in public land. So obviously, if you look at the Comstat State Park, one of the things to point out is that what we did, Marco was talking all about this, all about the ecosystem services that were provided. So through the NYSERDA project, we went through and discussed with stakeholders, did surveys to get a sense of their relative ranking of which ecosystem services are most important, developed utility functions relating the marsh simulations, and the sort of geometric metrics, like how contiguous the marsh is, or where the marsh is in front of infrastructure and the like, and develop these utility functions. And the whole thing gives you a relative ecosystem service value. So what we're doing here is that we combine all of these into a single metric that gives you a sense of what the ecosystem service value of these marsh parcels are relative to one another. And this is integrated with uncertainty through the year 2100. This is the ecosystem services. But with really large sites, what ended up happening was we had some really large sites that would give us some really huge ecosystem service value. So we capped that at 100. So something like Comstat State Park, a public site, would be capped at 100. But then if you look at some of these areas down here, you can see some of these private areas have the potential for marshes to start to go in there, and you can look at them relative to one another. So in this case, because these parcels are contiguous, and this always happens where I accidentally select everything and the whole thing turns blue. There we go. Because those two, that's just a browser thing where it thinks you're trying to select text. So there are occasionally some drawbacks to a web interface, but because these two sites are so contiguous to one another, the primary thing that's driving the difference in the marsh ecosystem service value here is the amount of marsh that they're predicted to have. So you can see that the expected acres in this site ranges from like 0.1 to 0.4, and this one ranges from 0.02, so it starts a little bit lower but goes all the way up to 0.7. And so because it has more marsh predicted in it over that 100 years, now if you were looking at some other areas and across sites, there could be some other factors like how close you are to development would affect the wave attenuation and the like. But so the other thing that's kind of interesting about this site here is that there is a potential for, first of all, it seems like there's a lot of privately owned marsh parcels here in the to the west of the study area. If you turn on the imagery here and turn off the overlay for a minute, there's some interesting land ownership patterns that seem to be kind of exclusively on marsh, but private and very very thin little parcels that are privately owned. But so there is some potential for ecosystem services occurring on these marsh parcels and some of the adjoining areas. It's interesting that this area here comes in as impervious. So I'm wondering if there's an existing, turn off the overlay here for a minute. Oh, that's because there is some sort of a road surface there, and whether that road surface effectively, whether there's potentially some walls adjacent to that road or not, I'm not sure, but that's a potential impediment to marsh migration there. So you can look at some of these, when you click on these, you can get a sense of sort of the total expected value in acres and the ecosystem service value, and you can look at them relative. So these two are sort of similar sizes, and they have similar ecosystem services provided. This one has slightly less, even though it is 11 acres. The site here is less than 11 acres. So this is a larger site, but it provides less ecosystem services than this smaller site does. So that gives you a little bit of I think relative information to one another. And again, if we put the marsh type on there, you can see why. This area here is pretty much protected by its elevation. It looks like potentially there was some fill brought in there. It's a higher site there. This area here to this parcel to the right, a lot of potential for marsh expansion due to the elevations. All right, and so that's just like an example of how you could look at that site. And let's look over and see what Crab Meadow looks like. I'm not sure that we've looked at Crab Meadow yet during this workshop. So it starts out with a lot. Well, I'm sorry, I need to go back to I need to go back to the current condition. So it starts out, there's a lot of high marsh, meaning that these are less regularly flooded, and they have more elevation capital. They're not getting flooded regularly. So as you sea level rise occurs, we assume that there still could be a viable marsh there. So you start to see more regularly flooded marsh occurring in these striations, which are probably primarily a function of the, you can see they pretty much exist. So that's primarily being built in as a function of that the existing elevation layer. You can see an expansion, more low marsh coming in. So overall, if you look at this fact sheet, you're going to see that this is a lot more resilient than what we saw at Mount Sinai, even under the highest sea level rise scenario. When we look at the probability map, it's going to be pretty red in there. But one of the other things that I like to point out when you're looking at these ecosystem service data are that I do feel like, as I pointed out before, there are some uncertainties there in terms of what's going to happen on these barrier islands. Whether these the barrier islands themselves, under sea level rise are likely to migrate to some degree to the extent that they're able to, or whether there could actually be a viable marsh there or not. Obviously, there's a viable marsh right behind it, but there's some uncertainty when you're looking at the barrier islands, in my opinion. And so Sunken Meadow, you can, in terms of probability maps, starts out, let's take a look at what marsh type we're starting out with. So again, a lot of high marsh that's existing here adjacent to the golf course and under the high sea level rise. You have a lot of expansion of that marsh, and there is actually some loss in this case of high marsh predicted. So it goes through the low marsh into the tidal flat under the highest sea level rise scenario. But ultimately, because the highest sea level rise scenario may not be is not thoroughly likely, there's still a good probability that that marsh is going to persist. But it is also worth noting the vulnerability of the area here to the north, this parking area. Let's see what that is. Tax boundaries. This is all state of New York, so it's all public land. So there's some vulnerable infrastructure in the barrier island to the north. Potential for significant marsh expansion at this site, but vulnerability. Now this site here, Nisisquogue River, I don't know how to pronounce that. I think someone told me once, so I can't remember. This is a little bit tricky one because there's a lot of it's a lot of public land up to the north, but let me see if I can get the black and white on here. Let me turn off the overlay here just to get a sense. So a lot of this is public land, but there are also a lot of private lands in different locations, and you have we defined this area to extend way down south. So let me go ahead and turn off the tax boundaries. What I was saying that's tricky about it is just that the tax boundaries are so complicated that it can kind of obscure the results. So we're starting with a lot of low marsh up north, some high marsh down south. and predictably the low marsh is a lot more vulnerable. The high marsh down south persists, expands a little bit. There is a point here, which is uncertain, where there's a like based on this barrier on West Main Street, the barrier to marsh expansion, we've characterized via the LIDAR data, but under the highest sea level rise scenario, we do predict that, that unless something happens there, that there could be some real conversion of some of this fresh wetlands to the south of the study area, which is why we included it. So under the highest sea level rise scenarios. But if you look up, go ahead,
sorry.
Marco. Thanks.
So this is exactly an example that when we do calibration, this is an example that we really look. So for example, if we don't get the connectivity that we are supposed to have, we go back and probably in this area, we saw that there is a culvert under that road that right now just connect, is more like a drainage area, but that in the future may allow the water to go past the road and become a tidal zone, really.
Yeah, but really only under the highest sea level rise. So really only when you get about 2 meters do you suddenly start to have that vulnerability. So there is potentially time to respond. But so if you look up in the north part of the study area where you had that low marsh existing, as you animate that, you can see there is some vulnerability there, but it's especially in terms of the tidal flats, a lot more open water occurring. So there could be some erosion impacts from that as well. But again, let's take a look at the tax boundaries now that we have it, and you can sort of look at this site and see that it already has a third of acre of marsh, has a potential to go all the way up to 1 acre of marsh. So it has an ecosystem service value of 6, and right adjacent to it, this has less marsh. It also has less capability for marsh to expand. And so it has a lower ecosystem service value. So it gives you some sort of quick references in terms of what might be promising and what might not be promising. But again, also that has to be taken into account with the uncertainty in terms of like if you were looking at this area up here, it says by 2100 it has a capability of there being a small amount of marshes. And if you go to high sea level rise, you can see it's a little bit of marsh encroaching here. So this ecosystem service value is being driven by what's coming on over here. And almost definitely that's not going to be a viable marsh, but it's going to be a beach. So I think that's something to bear in mind when you're interpreting these. Moving over to Stony Brook Harbor. Let's take just a overview, turn off the tax boundaries for a minute, take a look and see what's going on here. I'll start with the medium sea level rise and start at the current condition. Just go to black and white so we can see what's going on with the layers. So there's a lot of tidal flats and low marsh with some fringes of higher marsh existing there currently. Under the medium sea level rise, you're losing a lot of tidal flats and some of your low marsh, or maybe it looks like maybe half of your low marsh. There's also quite a bit of potential expansion up here to the north. Under the high sea level rise scenario, all that low marsh is lost and you start to have a lot more flooded infrastructure in this barrier island. So what's going on in that barrier island is going to drive things, but you definitely have a potential for a marsh of squeeze here, because you can see due to the higher elevations, there's not a whole lot of capability for expansion here in the south of the area. And so just giving you a sense of how you can look at these relative to one another. So what I want to do now is go to another hands-on exercise, which is, it's not very in-depth, but just to make sure people have an understanding of how to, let's see, go back to find the hands-on training for the second page. Okay. So in this case, we're going to go back to Mount Sinai Harbor again and just kind of look at 3 parcels that are highlighted here. I will navigate to them now. And we will just talk a little bit about what the viewer shows us for those 3 parcels, what is predicted for them, and what other considerations we might have for them. So I'll just start by navigating to go to imagery. Mount Sinai Harbor is right here. So I'll come in on that. Now the area we're looking at here is in the upper right. And if you can navigate, you can find this triangle. It's kind of the triangle and the 2 parcels above it. Now let me go ahead back to the current condition. So it's the triangle here, Wilmington Savings Fund. The parcel above, whoopsie, parcel above it, Cedar Beach Realty, and the parcel above that, the Dosher Sibulka parcel. My apologies for any names or places that I mispronounced terribly. I don't think we have any of the Dosher Sibulka family on the call today, though, so hopefully it's So if you could follow the, we'll just take 5 minutes again. You can follow the questions here, and then we'll cover that briefly. Following that, we're going to have a discussion of additional data that we can leverage for conservation planning, and talk a little bit about the next steps in the project. Okay, well, it's worth noting that this exercise is really more designed as a just to ensure the interpretation of data that's available on the tax parcel level is is readily accessible to people that are on this. I'm not sure any of these sites have really high conservation potential. So it's so the first question is, what is the current status of these sites with regard to marshlands? There's a couple ways you can look at that. You can render the marsh map, and again, we're looking at sort of these three sites here in the middle, triangle and rectangle and Oklahoma shaped parcels to the north of it. And so the first thing you do is you can render the current condition, and there are no marshes there. You can also, if you click on the individual parcels, you can see the current marsh is set at 0 for all of them. So none of them have any marsh in the current condition. And then the question is, what's predicted to have the most marsh under medium and high sea level rise? So if you bring it to 2100 and you come to a medium sea level rise, that's another thing you can do is you can have a single date, and you can sort of go back between low, medium, and high. You can do sort of an animation between low, medium, and high sea level rise to get a sense of the difference there. So which is predicted to have the most in 2100? It does look like from this picture, just because it's a larger lot, the one in the north has the most. And if you click on this, you can see the potential in 2100 is around 0.6 acres there, 0.5 acres there, and 0.3 acres there. So the metrics from the probabilistic run sort of matches the fact that under the low and medium sea level rise, the one in the north has the most. And then it's mostly, at least into the high sea level rise, it's mostly low marsh, although there's some fringes there in the middle. Under and also under the medium sea level rise, the northern marsh has the most. Now this is I think the reason that I chose these three parcels. Well, first of all, it's kind of interesting if you turn off the image, if you turn off the overlay for a minute. This site to the south here, it's kind of blurry. The imagery is a little blurry in the site, and you'll find that the satellite imagery sort of varies as a function of what was available. In this case, this is based on some ESRI source data that's publicly available, but it doesn't seem to be any development there. And if you turn but if you turn on the marsh type, you can see it's listed as flooded developed. And I believe what happened was that there was a house there that was removed. That's my understanding from driving around that on Google Street Images. In some of those images, there's a house, and other images, there's sort of a pile of dirt. So I believe there was a house, there was some development there that was recently removed. So that just gives you a sense of some of the uncertainty you have in terms of this. As you can see, the impervious data structure is pretty good. It's hitting these houses pretty well, but in this case, there's some uncertainty in the impervious data that we're looking at. So that is one thing to consider in terms of these results. So in terms of the comparative ecosystem services, the one in the south is 1.3, then you have 3 in the center, and you have slightly under 3 in the north. But the other consideration I think that's important when interpreting these is what currently exists there. The south, it seems like currently has nothing. This has, a house and a yard. This seems like it has 2 houses. So there's a really in terms of interpreting what the possible ecosystem services are, even though these two in the north. Also, the other consideration, as I was saying before, is that these are on the barrier island. And so this prediction of marsh type, of you have marsh coming in, I mean, these are at the elevations, these lands are at the elevations which could have marsh. And especially because they're now adjacent to existing marshes in the south, it is certainly possible that in the southern portion of this, it's more likely that there'll be marsh expansion, but some of this northern area here is likely to be estuarine beach, or unvegetated beach instead, just based on the substrate. So I think these results are interesting sort of from a landscape value, but landscape level, but there is some local interpretation that needs to take place as well. So if anybody had any questions about how to use the viewer or the mechanics of this hands-on exercise, please chime in, and I will otherwise go back to the slideshow. And Marco's going to just talk about, so we're going to head into this next section of the project where we're going to start talking about the development of conservation plans, which is what we hope to do. So we've presented the data analysis that we have so far, but in terms of the NYSERDA projects, Marco's just going to touch quickly on some additional data sets that could be leveraged.
Yeah, and I'm going to discuss a little bit how to use these data to consider conservation policies, and I hope to address also some of the some comments that I saw came out. So basically, we've seen some of the probability map, but in general, once we create all this probability map, we can actually produce all different kinds of probability map. We can focus on the existing marsh footprints and look at the probability of these existing marsh, what's the probability of being there, still there in the future. Or you might focus just on the new coastal marsh, so areas that today are not marsh, what's the probability of them to become marsh in the future. Same thing for habitat change, or if it's a coastal marsh or wetland, areas that are developed but they can be flooded in the future, what's the probability of these areas that they're going to be flooded in the future, and so on. So here in the next slide, a few examples. Here is on the top right, you see the probability of habitat change. So this is just to give an idea of what's the probability of certain land cover to change in the future. That gives an overall idea of how dynamic that landscape can be with respect to sea level rise, without focusing just on the marsh, but just on habitat change. Beach that becomes completely flooded, or marsh that becomes also, for example, mud flat, or areas that are dry that become wet. So that it gives you this idea, this sense of how things may change in the future. And then you go back on seeing, what is the probability of a coastal marsh or a new coastal marsh, if you just focus on areas that are not marshes today, but they could be in the future. And the last map is the probability of land converting to open water. And this is also important because that gives a sense of certain parcel what's the probability of becoming open water. So for example, if you are thinking about conserving certain areas, but you have a high probability of these areas being completely inundated and becoming open water in the future, you might rethink your conservation planning for those areas, because you know that maybe there is no much effort to put in there because they're going to be lost to water anyway. And so the next is just another example of how just focusing in some point in Nassau County, focusing on areas that today are not marsh, but in the future could be, how things change in the future. In 2040, you have relatively low probabilities of this dry land converting to marsh. But as the time proceeds on, you can see that those areas in 2100 becomes highly probable of becoming marsh. For example, in the south, you have a stretch of area that is highly probable becoming marsh. So that one could be one area of focus in terms of preserving, conserving, and to allow marsh migration in there. And so here I'm going to show a little bit how the adaptive strategies could be. Here I'm going to show the case of an entire marsh system, but you can think of having the same type of analysis. You can make it for just one marsh system and break it down to the different tax parcels, and how you can consider different policies and different strategies and how to implement your conservation strategies in the future. So this is an entire marsh system in the Thorn Preserve and Gardiner Park. And here on the left is the current condition, is mostly high marsh. And the one on the right gives you the footprint of what can get flooded in the future. So basically, this is the scenario of the very highest sea level rise scenarios, and it gives the footprint of how much area can get flooded if, you know, the sea level rise scenarios, the highest sea level rise is going to occur. And then you can break it down and look at, okay, in this area, let's focus first at the current marsh system. And what's the probability for this marsh system to persist in the future? And you can see that in this example, the marsh system, the existing marsh system, is pretty much doomed to sea level rise. Under all sea level rise scenarios, basically, you have a very low probability of persistence, except of the fringes on the top that probably will get flooded only for highest sea level rise scenarios. But the main core part of the existing marsh is highly not resilient. And so then you think, okay, what can I do? Maybe I can let the marsh migrate areas that are not marsh today. And so you basically break it down and you focus on the new marsh areas and you can undeveloped area, and you can see that you have a potential there of marsh migration. In the center, you have all these purple areas that are undeveloped area with high probability hydraulically to be suitable for marsh accommodation. And then you can see on the southwest corner, you can see that also lots of undeveloped area could become suitable for marsh migration, but having the dots in there, you know that those are houses. So those are all areas that are highly developed. So if you allow the marsh to actually also migrate in the developed areas, those dots are all filled up. And so you would have this is an entire marsh expansion, consider the existing and the new marsh. So potentially you would have, if you are able to implement all these strategies, let the marsh going in undeveloped, let the marsh going in the currently developed, you would have quite a possibility there in terms of marsh expansion. Some more probable, some less probable. So think about if it's broken down this by tax parts. So there were some areas that have higher probability of having marsh, areas that have less probability to having marsh. So you can focus on those tax parts that have high probability. But then you can have also other policies that you want to implement, like just maintaining the current marsh. In this example, we considered also thin layer deposition, which is more on conserving the current marsh. And just want to show you as an example for the thin layer deposition in W.T. Davis. Basically, it's taking most of the time dredge material and deposit it on top of the marsh, the existing marsh, to provide a little bit of elevation, higher elevation to the current marsh, so that it may become more resilient to sea level rise. Our results in our simulation show that in general, the thin layer deposition has a limited effect in the sense that you are buying 20, 30 years maybe with respect of sea level rise, which might be sufficient. Not that it's not a good policy, but if sea level rise is going to accelerate and continue to accelerate, then thin layer deposition in the long run does not solve the problem of marsh conservation, because basically, even if the marsh starts at an elevation that is slightly higher, thanks to the thin layer deposition, it's still the sea level rise rate is faster than the accretion rate that the marsh can keep up. So you're going to lose it anyway. So you want to think about the money you're spending on. If you're spending now and buy 10 years, is that worth it? And it might be that maybe it is worth it buying 30 years, because maybe in 30 years we figure something out, for example. And so then you try to put the cost in it. And then when you start putting cost in it, things change quite a bit, because here in this graph, we have the different marsh systems that have been considered in New York. So imagine if you have broken it down in tax parcels, you can have the different tax parcels and how basically here we report the benefit with respect of the cost. And we in New York, we really calculated, we try to quantify what the costs are. For example, if you have to buy a private property and what that cost would be. Or, for example, if you have just easement that is not buying the property, or if the property is private or public, as David was mentioning in one of his comments, things change quite a bit. And here in this example, we have all the different policies, conservation policies, from allowing migration to just undeveloped, to migration to all the developed area. The thin layer deposition, as you can see in yellow, is relatively, in the long run, give you lots of benefit. And the Pelham Bay Cove here is reported in, for example, the column in red, because the benefit per unit cost are so much higher, because Pelham Bay Cove is a public parcel. So the relative cost of allowing marsh migration in Pelham Bay is relatively cheap, because the ownership is already public. And so David was also mentioning that maybe, parcels that are just 1 acre size, the upfront costs are so high that are not significant. So there is a scaling factor also. Here in the entire marsh parcel we didn't consider, but when you broke it down per unit cost, you might consider in implementing your trade-off between cost and benefit, and consider the fact that if it's below 1 acre, it's just the cost is not feasible. Or when you consider, for example, making a current developed area, make it suitable for marsh migration, you have the added cost of removing whatever is impervious, which is an added cost to your project. And sometimes, most of the time, this becomes also very difficult. In this New York City example, also, I wanted to just mention it because it's in the graph. We also looked at the restoration to the 1974 wetland maps, because in New York City, going inland is kind of difficult because everything is developed and it costs quite a lot. So it's almost prohibitive to allow marsh migration inland. So one conservation strategy that has been considered is to restore to the 1974 wetland maps, because that are kind of protected from the water cleanup. Obviously, the restoration to 1974 require a cost that is quite significant, because it is not just a thin layer deposition, but is really filling up areas that are currently underwater, that have been lost for sea level rise, for boating, and other reasons that are just not sea level rise. Filling it up with lots of soil, do a real reestablished on Marsh, and with the hope that they also withstand all those factors that they killed them in the past. So you can see that the cost could be quite significant for this type of conservation plan. But basically, the idea is that you have a suite of possible conservation plans. You can associate the cost for all these conservation plans with the benefit and start looking at the trade-off and start looking at what you can prioritize in terms of your implementation.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, so I just in terms of responding to some of the notes, I was noticing that Camilo Salazar had said that they're implementing an integrated marsh management project at Gardner Park, and their preliminary results show great native plant recolonization, and also expect the sediment budget to improve. So that's an interesting question about the sediment budget. I think, as I had said, what we don't do is directly, because we're not a hydrodynamic model, we can't directly model sediment budget and the movement of sediment around. One thing that we could do, though, and that we have done, is that when we have information or expectation that there's going to be an improvement in suspended sediment availability to marshes, is you can modify that marsh accretion curve as a result of having the additional sediment. And that's one thing that the MEM3 model that we used for the NYSERDA project, at least initially, that has the capability of playing games with changing the amount of suspended sediment that's available, thus getting a different accretion feedback curve, and you can play games with how much more resilient to sea level rise that marsh could be as a result of the improved sediment budget. So I think we don't directly model the sediment budget, but we have information, or we can play what if games like, okay, what if we did manage to increase the amount of suspended sediment that's available to this marsh? We could potentially play games about what that would look like in terms of our projections under different sea level rise scenarios. So our time frame for this project is to work on developing these preliminary marsh conservation plans over the next 3 months. And our concept for what a marsh conservation plan is, and Vicky, you can jump in and correct me if I get this wrong at any point, but our concept is that it is not so much sort of a legislative document or something that provides a lot of requirements, but something that provides information that can be used across groups that will characterize what the marsh resource is that is being conserved, what kind of ecological and social benefits that marsh provides, and sometimes that can include some local quotes or information about how the marsh is utilized locally, and then some discussions about what the historical health of the resource, whether it has been increasing in marsh or decreasing. There can be some discussion about the risks to that marsh, whether it be sea level rise is one part of it. There could be other aspects as well. And then some discussion about potential ways that marsh can be managed across different groups and different resource, different groups and different organizations. So what we are proposing is that we will, through these workshops, identify interested groups, marshes that they want to focus on, and then we will work in a series of short Zoom working meetings in early November, December, and January, where we will, in November, sort of come together as a group, define the structure of the plan that we want to put together, and sort of define who works on which parts. In December, we'll have some intermediate feedback about how much progress has been made, start to piece the document together. In January, we will pull together all the pieces and work together to produce or present our draft conservation plan. Following that, we have some resources to participate in community workshops and roll this out to larger groups and get some comments from the community and suggested revisions and incorporate that into a final plan. And then incorporate that into a final project and complete the project in spring of 2021. I think we've discussed sort of what our available project support is, but we would work on a document framework and some of our data analysis we've already presented, some of the additional data that that Marco put together. We can do some additional literature analysis, but would really benefit from some of the local knowledge and some of the local input from local groups about sort of the ecological and social benefits that currently exist. So at this point in the meeting, we were hoping to have some discussion or some question and answer about which of the defined marsh areas that we'd looked at that you might be particularly interested or interested in doing this kind of work with us in, and what groups might want to work together on that. And then also sort of what ecosystem services that you would want to focus on as part of that marsh conservation planning. So I don't, so I guess I'll open it up with this first bullet. Is there interest in terms of collaborating on this? And I think it's the kind of situation where it's a little bit daunting because we're talking about doing something over the course of 3 months, but we're also wanted to emphasize that it's not necessarily going to be it can be as big a lift as you want it to be. It could, you know, it doesn't have to be a really long plan. So I know it's especially hard coming into the fall to contemplate adding something else. But are there any particular Suffolk County marshes that you would want to focus on? And are there any sort of natural groupings of agencies, organizations that would be interested in working on that? I'll just zoom back out to a broader view of the marsh systems that we've looked at. And you can, if you can, feel free to either speak up or chat in the. We didn't go way out to the. I think right as far east as we went was to Mattatuck River, but we were focusing more on the western portion. Do you see there to be a potential benefit of like a marsh conservation plan? I think part of it can also be educational because, you know, I think in one of the other conversations we had, people said that some people don't necessarily see this as, they don't see marshes as an ecological or a social or a cultural benefit. So part of it can be sort of a educational piece about what those marshes provide in terms of ecosystem services, even some of the ones that are a little more hidden, nutrient sequestration or carbon sequestration.
So this is Dave in Connecticut. I feel like an interloper because I'm not in on the island, but
I'm scrolling up to your. I'm just kidding. Sorry, go on, Dave.
But if there's if you have the opportunity, you know, we're planning on doing a marsh conservation plan using the SLAM data for one of our marshes in the central part of our coast, called the East River Marsh. It's actually one of the largest high marshes complexes in Long Island Sound. And when we start to think about a conservation plan, it becomes a little daunting because just the concept of a marsh conservation plan can mean a lot of different things. So what I'm going to suggest, and what we struggled with is, what would be in this plan? What do we have the resources to do? A marsh conservation plan can be really at a granular level to figure out, where are the culverts through a marsh that are restricting flow, that you can get that level of detail, or you can, go back out to a much broader picture of what needs to be done by each marsh. So whatever you decide, I hope you try to identify, make sure you can chew whatever it is you try to bite off, and upfront identify some modest goals, such as for those 20 marshes here, identify those that if nothing is done within the existing footprint of the marsh, a substantial portion of the marsh will likely be lost to mudflats or open water. And then for those, which of those perhaps do you want to develop thin layer deposition plans for? For those marsh that look like they can sustain a fair amount of sea level rise, and you want to work outside the existing footprint, identify the largest parcels with the greatest amount of potential marsh migration area that has a high probability, and focus just on those largest parcels, just because there's so much administrative cost associated with chasing or creating marsh conservation easements on tiny parcels, that when you actually get down to negotiate, identifying the property owners, getting appraisals, doing surveys, surveys, and there's just an incredible amount of administrative costs associated with negotiating and developing, consummating a conservation easement on a property. If you start working on small quarter or half acre parcels, you're really not going to make much of a dent. So I guess that you try to develop that framework for what's in your conservation plan to make sure that you try to get your greatest benefit from the least amount of staff time you're going to have and on the resources you'll have to accomplish it. And so I don't want to go on here too much more, but just be very careful as to what you expect to accomplish in this conservation plan, so it's something that can be doable within this really short period of time.
Yeah. You want to go ahead, Mark?
Yeah. So what you were saying also in your comment, it's like, and what we are trying to do, and I was trying to explain at the end, is really trying to assign a cost to this benefit, so that if you look at the cost, and you can include, for example, this scaling factor, or the fact that the property could be private or public, it makes a big difference with respect of cost. So you can kind of balance out your trade-off between what are your possibilities economically and what you actually can do. For example, in New York City, if I am not mistaken, they are thinking to take down a parking lot in Pelham Bay, because Pelham Bay is mostly public. If you have to do that privately, it's the cost becomes almost impossible. So having this approach that you break it down to either the tax parcel, and then you kind of look at both benefit on one side and cost on the other side, it gives you a way to proceed or think a little bit how you could implement certain policies and that account for practical problems. Like cost is probably the most important one.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example. So I guess my point more succinctly is to try to identify your low-hanging fruit at all of these marshes and focus on that. The parking lot's a great example. If you have 1,000-car parking lot at a state park, and 95% of the time, only 700 of those parking spaces are used, and the other part of the parking area is at an elevation. If you just simply remove the hard top, you get colonization of that area with marsh. You've at a pretty low cost, you've expanded that marsh without having to acquire new land. So to try to identify that low hanging fruit in each one of these marsh complexes, and then focus what particular actions you need to do to get there.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I like your idea about identifying those that are the most vulnerable, and trying to find the groups that would be interested in looking at that. And I think your point about the granularity of the report is an interesting one too. The part of the reason that our schedule is compressed is because well, it took us a long time to get the tax data, and then we also had a long delay due to COVID for a variety of reasons. One of which was that we were hoping to have a lot of these meetings in person. But so it is getting down to a little bit of a fine area. And I think that's what kind of my point about the plans is that we can make, if people had a lot of resources to work on this with us, then we could make it very granular. But there's a certain degree of granularity that we can offer up front, because we have a certain number of hours that we are going to offer support and work on these reports, and it kind of depends on how many that we define, and the interest of the group. So we're gonna, if we get sort of very limited additional resources, then they're going to be kind of at a bird's eye view. But I kind of like your point about and I think this also links into what Camilo was saying to a certain extent, is that you could come up with additional analyses or additional work or additional that part of the conservation plan could be a recommendation for additional analyses that is on a really fine scale, whether it be the implementation of some hydrodynamic modeling or looking more closely at what's going to happen with barrier island migration. That can, again, as it is a plan, part of that can be looking at things more closely that would identifying those analyses that will be the most useful. So again, I think that's part of the reason why I don't want people to be scared off in terms of saying, oh, we don't have the resources to support this, because some of it might just be helping us with some local users of the resource, some quotes from those local users that really help to characterize the value of the resource. And just some boots on the ground knowledge, pouring over some of the results with us and saying, well, helping us with some of the knowledge that people have from these, from spending more time on the ground at these sites. It's also, if we do look at something like, I don't know that when we looked at the costs for adaptive management, and we looked at the cost of easements, I'm not sure that we had sort of like our flat sort of transactional cost, our per easement, the costs that I'm not exactly sure how that, I can't remember how New York City Parks helped us come up with those estimates of what it was going to cost, but I'm not sure if it was sort of like a big upfront cost plus the cost of all the plus more of a per acre consideration, because from what you're saying, it sounds as though those transactional, those might dominate.
Yeah, no, we didn't have that. It was just a cost there was not an upfront cost, which can be included. That's all. In analysis, when you do a cost benefit analysis, you could include it. That if the size, the upfront cost is a fixed cost, and that would change definitely.
So there's a comment from Camilo talking about that it's difficult to list specific marshes of interest, as each marsh would need to be assessed. And then so they're right. So there's some South Shore marshes would be good to apply this model to. So we, again, in terms of this particular study, because we're in the Long Island Sound being funded by Long Island Sound Study, we were pretty much limited to the North Shore, although we do have SLAM results for the whole, for including the for all of Long Island. So so those are something that you can access by going to the modeling project website. So if you click on here, there's a lot, the uncertainty analysis results that form the basis of this are available for all of Suffolk County. We have it split up to the east and the west. They're big and it requires a little bit of GIS work. For this particular project, we're staying within the list study area just because of the funding source. Any other, let's see, let me go back to this and see. Does anybody else have any feedback in terms of what could be part of a marsh conservation plan that we haven't covered yet? Like what section would you suggest that would be useful? I guess it really probably depends on the specifically on the definition of the marsh first. I'm sorry, on the selection of the marsh. Vicky, do you have any questions that you want to ask or touch on before we adjourn this meeting?
No, I think that was a good overview for everybody, and hopefully people can take this back to their organizations and think about it a little bit more based on what was presented. And you know, we got one more workshop to go, and then we're going to kind of regroup and see where we're at. But I think people should definitely think a little bit more about how this could help the properties they own or the partners they work with in the communities that they're in. And like I said, we'll try to think of more of a framework maybe for the next kind of conversation so that people have some sort of example or something to go off of when we start planning out these conservation plans. And I appreciate Dave's comments. I think they're very helpful moving forward.
Well, I thank you all for your attendance and your interest. I know this is a long meeting, and it's a little hard to sit at a meeting for that long. Part of the reason why we were we were holding out for trying to do this in person, but hopefully next project. And I think that's it for now. So thanks again for your attendance. And we'll be in touch. You'll be hearing from us as we start to put together these groups, and you'll at least be invited to the next set of meetings. And you can feel free. You know, we'll probably start out by emailing everybody in this first email about the possible meetings, and I think probably we'll have you opt into additional email communication at that point, because it may be that we're selecting marshes that are outside your purview. And you just as soon not continue to be reached out to. So thanks again, and we'll hopefully touch base soon.